Please come to the front and bring your drinks. Yes, we're about to start. Sawasdee krab. Good evening, everyone. My name is Midnight. I am the Executive Director of APCOM, which is a regional organization working on health, rights, and well-being, and working with community groups in over 30 countries in the Asia-Pacific region. This year, we are in fact celebrating our 15th anniversary of working with the communities in our region. And it's such an honor to have you here tonight in the FCCT room, and also those that are joining us on our live stream as well. As part of our 15th anniversary celebration, we're actually convening over 60 community groups from the Asia-Pacific region this week to discuss around issues on diversity and inclusion in the business sector, around human rights, around access to health services, around well-being of LGBT in our region. So we have over 10 countries and about 60 participants here with us this week. Also, as part of our celebration, tomorrow evening, we'll be giving out awards to activists, allies, and also organizations that have been doing work to advance the LGBTQI rights and also advance the alleviation of HIV in the Asia-Pacific region. We also will be celebrating over the weekend Thailand Pride Festival 2022. So we hope that many of you can also join one of those activities that we're co-organizing with the community groups based in Thailand. As you may know, our region, the Asia-Pacific, still criminalizes homosexuality. About 15 countries actually that we cover in our region. And there are some great movements, particularly from the community, to advance and also really decriminalize this archaic law that prevents someone to be themselves, that prevents someone to love who they want to love and be who they want to be. And we are going to be looking at two panels for this session. First, we'll be looking at how community groups have been working to decriminalize in Sri Lanka and also in Singapore. And in the second panel, we'll be looking at more in Thailand in terms of how we are advancing trans recognition and also intersex recognition as well. This evening would not be possible without a collaboration from the Canadian Embassy. So I'd like to acknowledge Ambassador Dr. Sarah Taylor and also Sean Tinkler for the support from the Canadian Embassy. Actually, we're currently receiving funding from Global Affairs Canada to look at how to advance and promote and support the sustainability of LGBTQI organizations in 5 countries in the region, including Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And as part of that work, we're looking to ensure that the community groups are able to respond to the needs of their communities much quicker, making sure that at the policy level, their voices can be raised at regional, but also we're all hoping to influence the policy of Global Affairs Canada as well, particularly for our region. We know that funding for LGBTQ rights in our region is declining. We know that there are spaces for civil society groups closing. And we know that due to COVID-19, there's issues around security, issues around access to social safety nets, access to health services, access to justice, and access to also safe spaces for the community themselves. And without sustaining the community-led organizations, community-led services, we're really not going to be advancing the rights of LGBTQI and not going to be really delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals 2030. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, who's been really a champion for the region, for Thailand, but also globally as well. Professor Vijit Mantaporn, who is the UN Special Rapporteur, former member of the UN Commissions of Inquiry on Human Rights, and former UN independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So big round of applause, please, for Professor Vijit Mantaporn.
Sawasdee krab. Good evening, everyone. How are you? Very warm welcome to particularly friends from neighboring and other countries. And thank you to APCOM and friends, many friends, including the Canadian Embassy, Dr. Sarah, for the great support for this week's very important activities. The topic that has been conveyed to me for this evening is decriminalisation, which means doing away with the criminal law on certain issues. And I know that you're probably thinking about those 60-plus countries that still have laws against same-sex relations. But actually, there are more criminal laws than you think vis-a-vis against LGBT people than those laws in those 60 countries. And I will look at them individually. On the other hand, might you also need a criminal law sometimes to protect LGBTI people? That might also be an interesting consideration. And one angle is hate speech. Do we need a criminal law against hate speech in this region or beyond? So I will look at those dimensions individually and then round off with some other law-related issues, such as on gender identity and maybe a little bit on what you want to see in this country in terms of marriage and civil union. But primarily the talk this evening is on the criminal law and how it interacts negatively very often, but hopefully sometimes being also helpful to LGBTI. The first element to note is this. You're not far from a country that once had a criminal law against consensual same-sex relations. Thailand, about 70 years ago, had a law against consensual same-sex relations. And actually, I think it was drawn from British law, particularly the rather famous article or section known as Section 377 of criminal law, which is still found in some neighboring countries at this point in time, including in neighboring Singapore. But we'll talk about that, and we'll hear about the wisdom of Singapore in a moment. So let's not be complacent about what we see as a certain freedom, because there was a prohibition here some years ago. And even though it was done away with, you are still faced with a lobby that's not very open-minded here and there, who might want to backtrack. So we must be continually vigilant and constructive and rational and engaging at the same time. Thailand managed to do away with it, and we don't quite know how, really, because it's sort of some enlightened people just took it out of the criminal code. And we've all forgotten it, sort of. But we can't forget the fact that about 70-plus countries globally still criminalize same-sex relations. And we'll go into that in a moment. But let's start with the good news. Good news in the Asian region, well, congratulations, hopefully very soon Singapore will lift the ban. Thank you very much. Congratulations to the Constitutional Court in South Korea, which lift the ban on same-sex relations in the army. And many other countries. Bhutan! Wait. And before that, India, also with a court. And beyond. And some countries didn't really have a law against same-sex relations. Vietnam. Allegedly because the Napoleonic influence, the French influence, didn't quite incriminate same-sex relations. But don't be too complacent, because even with the French influence, in some of the French influenced countries, because of other influences, there are laws against same-sex relations, such as in North Africa. So let's be open and constructive on this. Currently, sadly, we still have 60+ countries that still have laws against consensual same-sex relations. And one of the tasks of the UN independent expert on prevention or protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity is to try to mobilize the global community to decriminalize, particularly as regards consensual same-sex relations. And there has been some progress, but there's also been regress. There's also been regress. Very recently in Afghanistan, definitely regress with Taliban coming in. Or even some rather negative voices coming from the Caucasus areas, or a big country that has a problem in Ukraine. One religious leader came out recently saying that gay pride is unhealthy, a so-called religious leader. So be careful, be careful. The momentum has to be sustained while we must be vigilant against backtrack. Having said that, let's look at the physiognomy of this region a bit. We welcome what's going to happen in Singapore, particularly to overcome 377. But Myanmar still has a 377. Malaysia still has a 377. And Brunei still has sort of 377. And then we have so-called religious influence coming in some areas, such as in Aceh, where previously it wasn't so strict, but now it's strict. One gay couple was whipped 77 times not so long ago, regrettably. So, number one, we advocate particularly decriminalization, bearing in mind that a lot of those laws are very antiquated colonial laws. They are remnants of colonization. And they've been done away with, for the most part, in the United Kingdom, of course, in Hong Kong, recently in Antigua Barbuda, but you still have it in the Caribbean, to some extent. And you still have it in Africa, and you still have influences of a more strict approach in Africa here and there too. Even though in Africa we welcome some good news, such as Gabon recently abolished the ban, and before that Botswana, and more recently Angola. So it's possible to progress all over the world, but beware of the backtrack, such as in Afghanistan at this point in time. That is the colonization angle, of which there are still remnants, which must be done away with. The second angle of criminalization is not so much from post-colonization or colonization, but alleged religious influences, particularly strict interpretation of certain religions. And that you can see in some parts of this region in terms of the seepage of a conservative so-called religious approach, which leads to more draconian laws, such as whipping 77 times. And actually, in regard to 377 in one country nearby, it's both criminal sanction of an imprisonment kind as well as whips. And of course, the global community cannot accept either, particularly the corporal punishment against people. And worse still, you know, in West Asia, it's not just corporal punishment, it's capital punishment in one country. It's capital punishment. Also for those under 18 years of age, which is totally an illegal practice also in the eyes of the international community. So there are also religious influences creeping in, and we should be very careful about this seepage of alleged religious dogma of a certain kind, whereas the kinder interpretation of religion is the one that we welcome, and that we would hope to promote a more open understanding of what we are. The third angle is other criminal laws that have impact on LGBTI, beyond criminalization of same-sex relations, beyond the religious interpretation. And the third angle is exemplified by cross-dressing laws. There are about 10 plus countries, several of which are in Asia, which prohibit cross-dressing, dressing beyond your assigned biological sex. In fact, the country next door incriminates cross-dressing. And you can be punished for dressing not in accordance with your assigned sex. And it often happens, of course, in regard to biologically born men who transition, who affirm themselves as transgender women. But not all news are bad. Surprisingly, you may find this development. In Kuwait, the Constitutional Court adjudged recently that the cross-dressing law, the law that prohibited dressing beyond your assigned sex, was and is unconstitutional. Amazing, really. So well done to Kuwait there, even though you might still have a problem with consensual same-sex relations, all right? Which is an interesting illustration of the situation. The situation is not homogeneous for LGBTI. It is not. In some countries, they are quite open to trans people. And you can affirm, transition, whatever you want to say, even with state help here and there. But they're not very forward-looking, very forthcoming towards same-sex relations, or vice versa. Classic case, Iran facilitates transgender women, particularly those who affirm or transition from being male. But Iran does not allow same-sex relations and will even execute gays for having same-sex relations, whereas it accommodates transgender people. But you must go through operational process, however, which is also something we disagree with internationally. So that is a third perspective of cross-dressing law, which still prevails in over 10 countries, which also has to be dealt with or done away with. And the fourth type of law is everything else in terms of criminal laws that have impact on LGBTI. Why? Because when we talk about the rights of all peoples, including LGBTI, we talk in terms of non-discrimination, non-violence, with regard to a totality of rights, civil, political, economic, social, cultural. So we must look at the totality of criminal laws that might have impact on what we are and how we operate, including the work of NGOs that advocate LGBTI. In this country, what is still worrying is that the anti-prostitution law of 2 decades ago still criminalizes a little bit the act of prostitution when you engage with others outside. And if you team up, etc., the sanctions go up. It starts at 1,000 baht fine. It used to be much more severe, and it goes up to several months imprisonment and 10,000 baht fine and so on. But it's not totally decriminalized in terms of sex work here, which has many impacts, including on HIV/AIDS as well, in terms of how people can come out and be open about what they are. So that is a criminal law still, which has impact on some LGBTI people who might be involved with sex work, But sex work is not a legal profession at this point in time in this country. And if you look at the totality of civil, political, economic, social, cultural rights, including freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and so on, you get into the rut of a whole series of criminal laws that impede exercise of voices and choices on the streets, in terms of what you want to put on social media and so on. We have very famous emergency decree here. We have martial law. We have computer crimes law. We have criminal law. How many laws do you want in this country that constrain freedom of expression? And many of these laws affect LGBTI groups that want to advocate or assemble, as well as others. And even the Pride that you will witness later this weekend, if it's out in the open, you probably have to notify the authorities also. Otherwise, the organizers might also find themselves under criminal sanctions. Not only under the Public Assembly law, but under other laws, such as the General Criminal Law, and previously the Emergency Decree, which was only lifted recently in this area here, but not quite in southern Thailand. So that is the whole range that you have to think about in terms of criminal laws that need to be decriminalized together with other options in terms of recognizing the totality of our rights, civil, political, economic, social, cultural, irrespective of our origins, and bearing in mind, of course, the special considerations of gender diversity, gender diverse people. Let's flip it. Do you need a criminal law to protect us or not? Or not just us, but others. One of the interesting debates also is whether you might need a criminal law against hate speech. And it's all too easy to claim the need for a criminal law against hate speech. Particularly draconian countries love to have more laws, because the offshoot of that is that they will be able to incriminate people more easily for expressing themselves beyond what is permissible internationally. If a country is to have a criminal law against hate speech, the criterion internationally is not so much the need to have a criminal law against hate speech, but to comply with the international provision on this as a sort of exception to freedom of assembly, freedom of association, and freedom of expression. And that is found in an international treaty known as the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 20 of which allows a particular exception where the country might have a criminal law in regard to what is known as incitement to hatred. It's more than hate speech. Hate is X hates Y. You need a law? The answer is generally no. You need other ways like good education to be empathetic towards the other side, or maybe self-regulation a bit on the internet. But incitement to hatred, which the international standard wants to overcome, is something more than hate speech. It's I incite, provoke you to hate someone with a view to violence and discrimination or hostility. It's quite a high threshold. But you can see that where a criminal law might be needed is in regard to a triangular relationship of I, X, provoking B to do something nasty, or tentatively to do something nasty to C, rather than just X disliking B. For that, there are other ways of dealing, including through inclusive education, including through some self-regulation and sometimes filters, etc. But again, bearing in mind the need for international standards. And bearing in mind that contextually we must understand that when you deal with the Asian situation, you're dealing with a lot of non-democratic countries. Therefore, beware of all criminal laws, including potentially also, even if you are to have a criminal law against incitement to hatred. So be very aware of all this. Why? Because these laws might be instrumentalized to nab, to overcome, to silence dissidents or opposition as a whole. And one opposition leader has been nabbed, instrumentalized, silenced, etc., for so long in a neighboring country for political reasons, as you may know. And he might be coming back to power very soon by means of coalition after 20 years out, where a certain instrument of law was used against him on the basis of alleged sexual conduct of a private kind, whatever it was, but obviously with some political implications because he was not able to participate politically. And of course, I remain nameless on all these issues because they're hypothetical with a certain realistic backdrop at the same time. So I want to round off by adding that, all right, if we claim that we should decriminalize and be very careful if we might advocate a little bit of a criminal law here and there to protect on the basis of permissible international standards, what is it that we should be looking to in terms of strategy, particularly on these criminal laws? Number one, advocate well to suspend these laws. Don't use the laws. Don't use them. That's the first thing. Don't apply. Moratorium, if you like, locally, even when you've not reformed the law. And that is certainly directed to a country which will be debating on repeal next week. You don't have to apply the law, even now. Good policy helps. Don't apply a bad law. Suspend it. Number two, repeal and reform. And maybe it has to go through Parliament and so on. And as we know in the country that will be repealing this very soon, leadership is very important. It's not just the political party, but it's the example, the guidance from the gentleman or the gentle lady or those who are not so gentle at the top. But let's hope they're enlightened, and let's get it through anyway. Number three, expunge. Expunge. That's what New Zealand has been doing. There are criminal records of gays and others that remain even after repeal. And more recent times, we advocate the need to clear those records, erase them, backdate it. And you know, for example, the gentleman who invented the computer, his records were there somewhere in the United Kingdom. They should also be expunged if they were criminal records of a certain kind in terms of stigma and taboo. The fourth element is rectify, remedy. Now, if an injustice has taken place, then redress should take place. At the very least, I mean, redress is a very open term. Remedy is a very open term. You might apologize. That's the very least. If a serious harm has really been done, people been killed along the way, along the march of history, we do have apologies, or more compensation, etc., as well as accountability sometimes. I mean, when ISIS, the terrorist group, was chopping off people's heads and throwing gays off buildings in the Syrian war, don't you think ISIS should be accountable sometimes? We tried to. I worked on Syria for 4 years. We tried to push it up to the Security Council to transfer it to the International Criminal Court, but didn't quite get there. But there's still an element of accountability in terms of that remedy. And at least to document the truth and air the truth, together with some short or long-term accountability of those who've done serious wrongs, particularly international crimes. And last but not least, 5, conscientize and educate. We have to educate from our experiences. And you probably didn't quite know about the expunge. I had to self-educate to talk about the expunging of the information, and we haven't talked about this at all in some of these countries. And I'm not sure, even though the Thai law was amended, 70 years ago, were there criminal records of those who might have been arrested beforehand? They should also be expunged, and an apology due. So that is the perspective of how to decriminalize, but be strategic in terms of the various entry points, in terms of the quest for justice, which is very often a long-term process. Now, last but not least is, since we're talking about the law, what else do we hope for in this country, certainly? Well, from the very start of the UN mandate of the independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, we advocated very strongly the need for anti-discrimination laws to protect people, as well as gender identity recognition, law to recognize gender identity. And in Thailand, it's so famous for being very liberal towards trans people, and yet there is no law to recognize gender identity. In other words, when trans people want to get their passport or when it gets their ID, they still have to put the assigned birth sex rather than what they feel as their affirmed gender on paper. And this is a still deficient state of affairs. We have some experiences from neighboring countries which could be constructive. In India, where previously there was a sort of 377 which prohibited same-sex relations, the top court overcame that. And India was also at the same time open to transgender people. And it wasn't all smooth, because there was an issue in terms of whether transgender people, in that openness of India towards transgender people, there was an issue as to whether they would be able to get a passport in regard to their chosen, affirmed gender. And so recently, there was a case that was taken up to the court in India on this issue, and the court said that transgender people should be able to get their document without coerced surgery. In other words, you should not need surgery to get your recognition. And it is all the more certain if you have a legal recognition law which stipulates directly that you can affirm your gender without the need for coerced compulsory surgery. Why do I say that? Because in Thailand we've had up and down various versions of gender identity law, even now in Parliament, and yet the mindset very much has been that if you want to change your ID or affirm your gender, which is different from your assigned biological sex, the Thai approach has still been that you need surgery beforehand. And the only real exception, but with difficulties, is if you're intersex, which is different again from transgender people. With surgery, you might get ID in accordance with your chosen gender if you're intersex, but that's different from transgender people. So that is still hanging somewhere. And I would advocate that we should not forget the need for gender identity law in Thailand, as well as other Asian countries, without the need for coerced surgery, please. And that is the international position. And certainly the position that I humbly adopted when I started as the UN independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, and it's still the same position with Victor today, and it is the position increasingly globally with the European Court of Human Rights, the Inter-American System Australia, Malta, New Zealand, and so on. So the flow of many countries today is in regard to your recognition of your affirmed gender, which is different from assigned biological sex. Affirm what you are without the need for surgery, unless you choose to have it. Last but not least, I know that somewhere you're interested in the partnership law, civil union law, and marriage law, and there are various drafts in the Thai Parliament at this point in time. Now, initially, a lot of time was spent on drafting the civil partnership or civil union law, and at the start of the drafting, some 4 or 5 years ago, there were various choices that had to be made in terms of the sort of draft of civil union law that would not be quite a marriage law, more of a contractual relationship between people to look after each other rather than marriage. And the marriage draft law came later. The model that was chosen at the start 4 or 5 years ago was the model that you probably found way back in, again, United Kingdom, or at least in England. So it was a model that advocated civil union partnership law as a sort of contract between same-sex people, not anyone, not including heteros. That was the English model. But at the same time, we were cognizant of the fact that there was also a French model that opened up to everybody, including heterosexuals. And what is interesting is that the British model has now had to be amended to cover heterosexuals. And in France, it is proven that the civil union, civil contract, civil partnership has been used more by heterosexuals than homosexuals to date. But of course, in these countries now, you have marriage law. So, one element now with the law in Parliament is whether we go for a sort of improved version of civil union law that opens up to everybody, or just for gays. And there are 2 drafts. One is for everybody, and the other is for gays. But I think the flow might be towards for everyone. And that is paralleled by the other law, which is marriage law. Marriage law. And marriage law is basically, well, for particularly to open up to LGBTQI, particularly to same sex. Bear in mind that the second one has also to be cognizant of the fact that there are cultural undercurrents also which might test the second law, which is particularly to be tested by religious undercurrents, as was tested globally, including in Australia. And half the Australian law on same-sex marriage is on what to do if the priest refuses to officiate. The Thai law may have to deal with this ultimately. Whereas with civil union, initially we didn't have to deal with the religious angle. But later, because it became politicized, the various conservative religious elements took up the cudgel, saying, oh, even the civil union law should consult us. Whereas initially it wasn't a religious issue at all. But now it has become a religious issue, a little bit, even in regard to the civil union law. But certainly marriage law was questioned by religious elements years ago when it was touted a little bit. And last but not least, the courts didn't help too much. They helped a little bit because, of course, with this competition between different lobbies of what do you want, you know. There was a case that was taken up to the Constitutional Court of Thailand a couple of years ago, which claimed that Section 1448 of the Civil Code is unconstitutional and that it should open the door for everyone to get married. Section 1448 of the Civil Code is basically marriage is between man and woman. Now, this was taken up to the Constitutional Court of Thailand by a lobby that disagreed with the other emerging civil union law because the lobby wanted pure marriage, so to speak, and to overcome 1448. It was taken up to the Constitutional Court of Thailand. Constitutional Court of Thailand said, no, 1448 is in keeping with the Thai Constitution and Thai traditions. And having said that, the court sort of shoved it back to the politicians by saying, but we ask you, the pillars of the state beyond the courts, to amend the law to be more reflecting of, or cognizant of, or tolerant of gender diversity, without saying what law. So now the ball is in the parliamentary court as well as the executive branch. In other words, this, again, competition between the two laws. I don't mind, just whatever, just let's get on with it. Whatever the law, I'm in favor of all of them. Have them all if we wish. And I'm not restricted to gay union either. I'm open to whoever who wants to love and have a friend, to be recognized and to be able to care for each other in their integrity and dignity. So that's where we are today. And I hope that what we'll learn from our friends from other countries will enable us to be even more enlightened in terms of the next stepping stones. The work is ongoing. There has been a lot of progress. There has been some regress. And as with all human rights for everybody, irrespective of what we are, please be vigilant, be kind, be empathetic, be engaging. Through all these little entry points, we will provide hope and be part of that constructive, transformative change.
Wow, what a wonderful keynote. As always, Professor Vichit, thank you so much. ขอบคุณมากครับ And that's something that I can say and add to that, really so comprehensive. Look at that global, regional, and at countries. So let's move into our next session, and I would like to invite our panelists from Sri Lanka, Rosanna, and from Singapore, Brian, to come up on stage. Yeah. Great. So we are basically going to hear from activists, really brave activists from Sri Lanka and Singapore in terms of what are they doing around decriminalization in their own settings. Rosanna, I'll start with you, if that's okay. So Rosanna is Executive Director of Eco Grounds, based in Sri Lanka. And I think you better tell your story because it's fascinating. Yeah.
Always a difficult thing to do after Professor Vichit has been let loose on the audience. So I'll do my boring best to try and outdo you, Professor. It's really good to be here. Thank you, Midnight, APCOM, and all the friends for inviting me. As Midnight said, my name is Rosanna Flema Caldera, and I'm the founder and executive director of Equal Ground in Sri Lanka. We are the oldest LGBTIQ organization, and we're still going strong, thanks to a lot of friends, particularly the Canadian High Commission in Sri Lanka, Global Affairs Canada, and various other donors. I'm just going to take you briefly through a small history of criminalization in Sri Lanka. Of course, in 1883, the British brought sodomy laws to Sri Lanka. And in 1995, there was a private member's bill put in Parliament to decriminalize, Section 365 and 365A. How that came about, the 365A, was because at that time, when the private member's bill came up in Parliament in 1995, the then Justice Minister thought this was very gender biased. So he took out the word male from the laws, which meant that any person with another person, and it didn't matter which gender, which sex. So in other words, it opened it out to women, transgenders, everybody in the LGBTIQ community, And what's not known widely in Sri Lanka, by doing that, they also include heterosexuals. Whoopee. Anyway, the bottom line is 365 talks about carnal intercourse against the order of nature. We don't really know what that means. Neither do the police. Neither do the politicians. 365A is acts of gross indecency. Here again, we don't know what that means. I think the entire government commits acts of gross indecency all the time, but they are not taken to jail on it, yeah? We are. So that is the worst case scenario in Sri Lanka. This, unfortunately, these laws have been used mainly by the police to harass, discriminate, bribery, sexual bribery, rape, and all kinds of other tortures have been perpetrated on the LGBTIQ community based on the laws. But the laws are very specific. The laws state any person in private or in person, they have to be caught in the act of committing sodomy or acts of gross indecency or against the order of nature. However, the police decide that just because you're gay, and then it has just carried on from that, that everybody thinks that just because you're from the LGBTIQ community, you're automatically a criminal. They don't go into the wherewithal of what the law actually says. And to be quite honest, the LGBTIQ community also don't know. So one of the things that we have taken to task is basically to try to sensitize and educate, is one of the foremost things that we have decided to do right from the time that we started. Because, number one, the LGBTIQ community, they don't know who they are, or they didn't. They didn't know what they should do. They didn't know whether they should hide, or whether they should pretend to be straight, or what. They didn't know what lesbian meant. They didn't know what homosexual meant. So, and of course, we have two other languages in Sri Lanka, Tamil and Sinhala. So when these things are translated, there's a whole alphabet there that's going crazy, and nobody knows what the heck it means. So the first thing we had to do was to change all the derogatory terminology in Sinhala and Tamil to reflect positively on the LGBTIQ community. And these are the words and sentences that are used now. I hate my phone. Every time I open it, it says something about Face ID, and it doesn't take my face. So whose face is it taking? Probably Professor Vittit's. So I want to just talk about a little bit about the progress of LGBTIQ rights in Sri Lanka. One of the progresses is the transgender certificate, recognition certificate. We work closely with the Human Rights Commission, Sri Lanka Human Rights Commission, and we did bring to their attention that there should not be any reason for a transgender person to go and have surgeries or go to a psychiatrist in order to identify as trans, but some doctor in the ministry decided, no, they have to go through psychiatric evaluation and start hormonal as well as surgical processes. So that's there, but it's certainly not a foolproof situation. It is a certification. The Registrar of Persons needs to issue it after a letter from your psychiatrist or your doctor. And speaking to transgenders just the other day, there were so many problems about changing their birth certificates, changing their EPF, ETF through the Labor Department, for example. Changing or accessing bank accounts after they have changed their names and stuff like that. So all the things that we take for granted as people who are not changing our gender identity is something that a bit of a nightmare still for the transgender community. We've had some very positive media since 2015, thanks to also all of the media training that Equal Ground has done. And that has actually helped open the spaces for LGBTIQ persons a lot more in Sri Lanka. I think it's also necessary to say that most of the LGBTIQ persons now, up to 2015, we had a very repressive government. We had just ended the 25 plus year war with the LTTE, the Liberation of Tamil Tigers for Elam. And the government at that time was very, very, nationalistic and did not encourage anybody other than the Sinhala Buddhists to be, on top. So NGOs, civil society organizations working on human rights were routinely harassed, closed down, jailed, whatever. But in 2015, they lost by a landslide, the government, in the elections. And we had 5 years where things were, sort of okay politically, not ideal, but certainly we didn't have to shut our mouths or hide behind closed doors and be afraid anymore. But of course, since the economic crisis and COVID, things have changed again in Sri Lanka. I'm sure you all would have read in the news that there's been huge protests at the state of the government and the state of the country. Very recently, they have started cracking down on protests. They have arbitrarily arrested people, kept them in detention without charging them, tortured, and done all kinds of horrible human rights violations on people, and this continues. The economic crisis is just, it's at a stage where you can't even think about what's going on elsewhere when you have a lot of things to worry about, like feeding your family or keeping your job, and trying to find a way to actually just pass the time until things hopefully gets better. So very recently, there was a private member's bill, another private member's bill put in Parliament to ask for an amendment of the penal codes to decriminalize same-sex sexual relationships, and of course, all the LGBTIQ community. I personally, and Equal Ground, and a lot of people within the LGBTIQ community have a lot of issue with that. Because we know what happened when we last amended that 365 and 365A. It just got worse. And it seems like a very convenient time to suddenly have a private member's bill coming up in Parliament when we are negotiating for IMF loans and the ADB loans and various foreign loans to keep Sri Lanka afloat. Now, I don't mind the reason why they're suddenly doing this, but I do want to know that once the loan is given, whether this will be taken and then shoved in the pocket somewhere and forgotten about, and worse things can happen. Right now, worse things are happening, so we hope it doesn't happen to the LGBTIQ community. But one can never tell. But it is also a step in the right direction if you want to have two sides of the coin on this. Maybe I'm just old and jaded and I'm suspicious of everybody, perhaps, I don't know. But I believe that there should have been consultation with the community before this bill was put forward. I met with the MP that, of course, closed the barn door after the horse has galloped all the way to, Patpong or wherever. And he said, why don't you help me lobby the parliamentarians? That's not my job, to lobby the parliamentarians on your bill. You should have consulted us first, and then we would have told you in which direction it should go. We also find it suspicious. So, it's like, I don't know. It's very difficult to tell what people's motives are for suddenly coming up with something that we had no idea was happening. So one could look at it as a progressive step, and one could look at it with suspicion, like I do as well. But we have, of course, offered the member to actually sensitize and educate the parliamentarians so that before the bill comes for debate in Parliament, people would have a different idea of what LGBTIQ persons, or who LGBTIQ persons are. Because as you said also, Professor, educate, sensitize. That's what we've been doing for the last 18 years, and that's what we have proposed to do. We are also working very closely with the joint opposition, the leader of the joint opposition and his party, and we have suggested the same thing to them, that they sensitize and educate their parliamentarians and their MPs, and they're very open to that. They've also asked us to put in a, write the manifesto for them on the part of LGBTIQ, and so we have given them our requirements, and we've written that section of the manifesto for them, so that there is no, chopping and changing and saying, well, this means this or this means that, and it's in all 3 languages. Legally, in 2018, I filed a case with CEDAW against the Sri Lankan government, saying that they are violating my rights. And the CEDAW committee actually ruled in favor in March of this year, which I was very, very happy. And they've made several recommendations to the Sri Lankan government, including decriminalisation of consenting same-sex sexual relationships. We've also brought a fundamental rights case against the police for actually inviting a very homophobic and crazy lady to speak at their, briefings of, young police officers passing out in trainings and stuff like that. And she has actually posted the YouTube video of her, shouting homophobic slogans and asking them, would you like your kids to grow up gay? Would you like your kids to be preyed on by the gay community? This is what they do, that, and blah, blah, the usual stuff. So we filed suit, and it's still a work in progress, but the police have said that they are willing to make a decision on not allowing any homophobic rhetoric to be brought up and talked about within trainings and so on and so forth. It's a step in the right direction, even though it might take a little bit of time. And obviously the first 4 or 5 times that court was in session on this, they didn't even show up. So, this is just dragging, and they hope that it'll drag long enough so that we will drop it, but they don't know me, I guess. And as I said earlier, the biggest issue is the police, because the police have been, arbitrarily arresting, torturing individuals who they perceive to be gay, lesbian, transgender. 2 years ago, the police burst into a hotel room and arrested 3 men on charges of 365 and 365A. They were doing nothing but having drinks and having bites. They kicked down the door, they beat these people up, they tied their hands with wire, they took them to police custody where they had the JMOA come and do anal examinations to verify that they are indeed gay. I don't know where they're coming from. But eventually, soon after our case was brought up in court, the court dismissed all charges on these 3 persons, saying that the police had violated their fundamental rights. So one good thing came out of that. There have been many cases like that. There's just the first. Some of the other cases are of lesbian women who have been incarcerated by their own families, by their own parents, tortured, beaten, they refuse to be allowed out even to go to their jobs. And fortunately, they've taken it with friends, with the help of friends, to actually go and file a case against their parents and against the police, because police have been called in and they immediately arrested the girls and put them in lockup, and then, said they have to go through psychiatric evaluation because they must be psychologically imbalanced because they're lesbians. So that too, the court ruled in the favor of the girls, which is really, really good. And that's really positive, because the judiciary has been amazingly, engaged in the past 2 years, mainly because of all the issues that we've been having legally within the country, with the economic situation, with the arbitrary arrests of protesters and so on and so forth. The legal fraternity has come out in force to support civil society, which wasn't the case before. It was very, very politically managed, so to speak. So I think I'm going to stop there, and hopefully there will be questions at the end. But as you can see, it's a bit of a seesaw in Sri Lanka. We get one thing going, and then something else comes up that's going to just knock that out of the ballpark somewhere. And then, so there's no balance. There is no, it seems that this president that we have is keen on decriminalization and putting in policies of equality and non-discrimination, but we have to wait and see once the donors have finished their assessment of Sri Lanka whether that's going to still be the case. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosanna, for letting us know about what's happening in Sri Lanka. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Brian Chu, who is the chair of Uka Chakra. Brian, you tell your story. What's happening in Singapore? Everyone's been dying to hear, this coming good news.
Right. Thank you so much, Minette, for inviting me to this panel, and also thank you for the Canadian High Commission in Thailand for organizing this event with us, with APCOM. Also honored to share the platform with Professor Vidi and also with Rosanna. Wonderful story there. I will try to organize my sharing into 3 bits. One is the context that I operate in. And the second part is actually sort of the journey that we went through. It's 17 years of my involvement in the LGBT community, so it's quite long. I don't know how to condense it. I try my best. And the third part is potentially why I think how we got to where we are today. So for the context, for some of you might be familiar that Singapore is going through a process of repealing Section 377A. This, as we speak, still stays in the book, but the Parliament will debate next Tuesday on the 28th of November. The ruling party, the People's Action Party, will not be lifting the whip according to our best knowledge. That means the party members have to vote along the party lines. So it's very likely to go through smoothly. That said, we wouldn't discount the fact that they will pull out their best to have a robust debate. Probably not going to be constructive, very robust, but not necessarily constructive, because they will be quite ugly during the debate itself. So I was intending to fly back just to go into the chamber to see what is being said, but then I decided that it's too expensive, the air tickets, to go back just for that conversation. So that's what's happening right now in Singapore. I'll give you the context of my personal background and then the context of Singapore so they can understand the development a bit better. My background, I'm a counselor, I'm a trained counselor. I've also worked in the LGBTQ community for 17 years, since 2005. Started off as a very clueless support group facilitator. Never knew that I would end up being one of the few people who people will associate with the repeal of 377A. So as an individual, I'm quite introvert, so I believe in closed-door conversation, closed-door engagement, constructive conversation. So a lot of times what you see reported about what is done in Singapore, it's just a snapshot. You probably won't hear the full story behind. So that's my personal context. I also approach my LGBT activism work in a way that annoys the Singapore government enough, but doesn't disengage them. So I hope I've been doing it correctly, hence they're still keeping me in conversation. So that's my personal background as a context. The Singapore country context is that some of you might be familiar. Singapore is very economically developed, socially very conservative. What it means is that if the government does not want to do anything, it moves very, very slowly. It moves so slow that I think the glaciers melting will happen faster than how we change things, right? But when you have decided to move things fast, it moves really fast. And that is really what's happening with the repeal of 377A. The other context is that since our independence from the British colony, since 1965, there have been one ruling party. We have not changed the ruling party since then. So in a sense, there's a lot of stability that creates a lot of space for them to change things if they want to, but it also means there's very little political will if they want to, very little political drive that the other opposition would like to take on the repeal itself as a key conversation piece. Some of the opposition party that we have raised the issues of human rights, raised the issue of LGBT rights. They have also sometimes talked about it in their mandate, but very few big enough opposition parties, so to speak, will take it on as their party agenda. So that's the context we're with. So hence, it means that a lot of times when we want to move things in Singapore, we have to work with the government. That has not changed since 1965. So that's the background, the context itself. I'll give you a run-through of the timeline of where we ended up, where we are. Hopefully by next Tuesday, we will have the repeal completed. There's an interesting story behind this. The repeal of Section 377A, which essentially is the law that criminalizes same-sex consensual behavior between two men, the whole process was kicked off by consensual oral sex between a heterosexual couple. It's a funny story because most people wouldn't realize that basically what happened was in 2007, there was a policeman who had a consensual oral sex with a 16-year-old woman. And because because the oral sex did not lead to penetrative sex or vaginal sex, she decided to bring this policeman to the court. And so it uncovered that in 2007, the whole Singapore realized that consensual oral sex was illegal in Singapore. So it got everyone surprised that something that we do quite commonly is illegal in Singapore. So that kicks off the whole process of we need to repeal this. We need to review this and repeal this. And that created the opportunity for the LGBTQ community in 2007 and say, if they are going to repeal 377, we need to use the opportunity to repeal 377A. And so that kicked off the whole process of us trying to repeal 377, and that was in 2007. There was a parliamentary debate because there was a signed petition. A signed petition in Singapore is very rare. Singaporeans are generally not interested in political issues. And so that parliamentary debate, because it was supported by a written petition, was kind of a rare thing in Singapore context. And we have collected more than 8,000 signed signatures, complete with names and NRC, which is the ID of our country. It's a very rare, so two things came from there. The parliamentary debate obviously ended up with, the government decided that they would not repeal 377A, but it also sparks off a whole LGBT movement in Singapore, that people are prepared to put their name, have their ID submitted into the parliament, and be recognized as being either part of the community or being supportive of the repeal itself. So that sparks off the first really a ground-up movement that we have never seen in our previous history before. That failed, even though there was a robust debate. Some debate was quite ugly. That was the first time the Prime Minister, who is still the current Prime Minister, Lee Hsien Loong, said that Section 377A would not be repealed, but would not be enforced. That goes back to the first point that Professor VT was talking about. Don't enforce bad law. So that was the first position they took. And then after everything died down, in 2007, there was another case where involving a gay person who was caught having public sex in a public space. A deputy public prosecutor got too excited, decided to press a charge of Section 377A on the person, then tried to backpedal it and realized that cannot be stopped, because it then went against the Prime Minister's parliamentary promise that it will not be actively enforced. So that sparks off the first round of the constitutional challenge by 2 parallel cases. Of course, that didn't happen. That happened but failed. So then the community continued to rally, even though 377A remains in the book. We continue to mobilize ourselves. We can continue to be active, be visible. Some of you might be very familiar that we have an annual event called Pink Dot, which is a space where Singaporeans can come together and express their thoughts. And one of the main things is talking about our presence in the Singapore community, in the Singapore society. The gay LGBTQ community is part of the Singapore society. We demand the law to be repealed. So there has been an ongoing movement on ground on an annual basis, being visible for that. 2019, when the Indian Supreme Court decides that 377A was unconstitutional, it sparks off the second round of interest. There were 3 people who were actually quite, interestingly, there are 3 persons from the establishment. The first person was one of the ambassadors at large, Professor Tommy Koh, who says we should try to challenge it again. The second person was the government head of the communication, head of the government communication, who said we should consider trying again. And the third person who said that was the current law minister, and also the law minister who is now sort of driving the repeal process itself. He said that whoever wants to challenge can go ahead again. So immediately after that, there were 3 cases filed to challenge the constitutionality of 377A again, myself included in one of them. So all things happens in 2021. The High Court says no, it doesn't go through, and then we went for the Court of Appeal again in 2021 again, and the final decision came from the Court of Appeal in March this year, in 2022. By the time the Supreme Court decides to pass their judgment, rather their rulings, it was quite clear that there wasn't any hope. In my opinion, it will probably take another 5-10 years before we get the ball rolling again. In my opinion, it will be beyond my generation. The ball will be in somebody else's hand. Remember, I told you Singapore either don't move at all, or it moves very fast. So then, very quickly, the law minister himself went to the parliament and said the Singapore government will find a solution to resolve this once and for all. It was vague. He just mentioned that he will resolve it once and for all. On a very rare occasion, he acknowledged that the LGBTQ community is part of the Singapore society. It's the brothers and sisters. Quite a human approach in expressing his thoughts in that. And it's not the first time he actually says he has a personal view about people should not be decriminalized. People should not be criminalized because of their sexual orientation. And thereafter, after that parliamentary speech itself, he started to engage, not just his own ministry, the other ministry started to engage the LGBTQ community and the other stakeholders very, very frequently on a nearly 3 months basis. Something strange happened during that period. It's a very strange thing. We still couldn't wrap our head around why that happened. There's a department in Singapore government called the REACH. Basically, it is a platform that sends survey out and seek opinion of Singaporeans on certain issues. It's usually, the surveys are usually not responded well. People don't care about issues. Out of a sudden, there was actually a survey rolled out from the government platform asking for the opinion of people on LGBT issues. It was unheard of, and we still couldn't wrap our head why that happened, who sent it out, who initiated it. Our sources couldn't tell us anything. But what was surprising is that even though the distribution of the survey was quite close, in a very close network, it went out and basically the system got overwhelmed, right? Our internal joke is that somebody must have hoping to clock some KPIs for the year, wanting to have some hit rates on their website, decided to find this must be the topic to go for. and obviously hit the KPI for the year, probably get a bonus from that. But what happened is that if I put aside my cynical self, it also means that it's part of the exercise for the government to sort of sense the ground itself, whether the country is ready for that. And quite consistently, in different types of survey agencies owned by the government, or rather, not owned by the government, rather does survey on behalf of the government, it has been showing that the signs of Singaporean ready to accept a repeal is happening. So the final finale, rather not the finale, the show before the final finale was at the National Day rally that was on the 21st of August. The Prime Minister decides to announce that the government will repeal Section 377A. Obviously, it was a very mixed feeling because in the same speech itself, he also says that he will put in measures to protect marriage. So in the international media itself, there were two pieces of information picked up. One is Singapore will repeal 377A, hooray, everyone is excited. The second piece of the information was, which got everyone very confused, is that they will put in measures to protect the law, protect the marriage itself. So for the next 24 hours, we were all confused what exactly that meant. So by the evening on the 22nd of August, the law minister came out and clarified that we are not going to enshrine the definition of marriage in the constitution. Basically, the protection they are talking about is to prevent that the definition of marriage will be challenged through a court system again. If there's a purpose to think about marriage, redefining marriage, civil union, civil partnership, whatever that might be coming up with, it must stay within the parliament, the ouster clause, basically, that the parliament gets to decide on marriage issue. So I think when people read the international media news, it gets a bit confused. Oh, Singapore decides to ring-fence the protection of marriage even further, but that's not the truth, because nothing immaterial actually changed. It is just not allowing the constitution being challenged, rather the marriage itself being challenged in the court itself. And I guess one of the things that the government also maintained quite consistently throughout the whole conversation is that they believe that laws should be changed through the parliament, not the courts, the judiciary system itself. I think we all have different opinion about that, but that is the position they take. So that runs up to where we are next Tuesday. I hope I will have good news to share with everybody. I think we should be 99.9% that we will get there, but that's where we are. I don't know how much time we have, but I just want to highlight a few things on why I think this is happening. On the political front, I think I trust that the law minister himself has over time understood the issue faced by the LGBTQ community better. And I think it's through the effort of various engagement done by various organizations, various individuals. He no longer sees, there's a personal position that he has always had, but he feels that it is a right enough time for it to change. So that's my opinion on the law minister. The second thing is that I think the Prime Minister feels that it's also a right thing to do. Going back to what Professor Bidi said earlier on, it is about repeal. So the Prime Minister feels that he's ready for it. But also, in the context, a bigger context is that he's planned to step down as a Prime Minister soon. And I strongly believe that it also means that he wants to clear the way and stop kicking the can down the road for the next Prime Minister to take over. He doesn't want the next Prime Minister to inherit this problem. So that's the political front. But on the grassroots level, I believe that actually the grassroots movement that we've been doing for a good 15 years, even though there was a lot of disappointment, many of us felt completely burned out. There was a huge effort in mobilizing the ground. And although in the past few months, a lot of interviews has been with me and with a lot of people who fronted the challenge itself, to be honest, I think that effort itself was just a small fraction of that. The main part of it actually is how we have been able to mobilize people from the start of the signed petitions in 2007 all the way to people showing up in the park itself to be counted during Pink Dot itself. I think that social movement itself actually created energy that to tell the government that actually we cannot be ignored anymore, right? And I think it really means that a lot of the people who are involved in the movement brought their professional experience. So I always tell people that activists itself are passionate, but not necessarily the best people to mobilize things, right? Passion doesn't change things alone. So there are people who are, be it filmmaker, be it social legal researchers, be it journalists, even religious leaders. Some religious leaders take upon themselves to actually talk about LGBT issues. So things change, right? We also have nominated MPs who also fronted all these issues over and over again. So I think things changed, and it didn't just happen because of the court challenge itself. So essentially, I think that's the whole thing that kicks off the whole momentum leading to where we are. Finally, I want to say that the repeal itself is just one small step. It's something that we spend a huge amount of effort in, 15 years of many of our lives and money and resources. There are lots of things that we need to resolve from this point onwards. It won't be easy. I think the challenge is now, once it's repealed, the movement itself does not have one single cause to rally around. It means that we have to re-figure out what is something that matters to everybody, or actually there will be a lot of issues that matters to everybody. So that's the context of Singapore. Thank you.
Oh, wow. Thanks so much, Brian. As someone you're saying, 15 years working on this as an introvert, but you also have time to work with APCOM as chair of the regional advisory group, so that's amazing. And yeah, we look forward to hearing good news next Tuesday. We unfortunately don't have a lot of time, but there are speakers, Brian and Rosanna will be here with us this evening. And yeah, please do talk to the journalists who are here in this room. And we'll just like to shift to the next speakers on the Thailand around gender recognition for intersex and also for trans people. Thank you so much. So Nada, Chayajit, Teek, Toto, and Nuk, yeah, please. Chaka, please take your seats. Yeah. Oh.
อยู่แปลมาใช่ไหมไม่ได้แปลที่ไม่ได้แปลที่ไม่รู้ว่ามีอะไร I just
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being with us this evening. And yeah, without further ado, I'll just maybe pass on to Nada Chayajit, who is LGBTQI activist in the region for a long time and very well known in Thailand. Tell us about what's happening around gender recognition and particularly around the intersex recognition in Thailand.
Good evening, and I was excited. Now I'm sleepy. So it's been just a long day during the climate change. So usually after Roy Krathong, we're supposed not to have like heavily raining like this, but yes. So the show must go on. And let me put it this way. I'm gonna tell you a bedtime story about what I dream for, what trans and intersex individual dreams for having such an inclusive legal gender recognition. And what I'm going to present, I mean that whoever working on the legal gender recognition laws, they are our friends. They put their efforts to ensure that they kick the law, they kick the ass of those who are in charge in the House of Parliaments, who in charge in the cabinet, to understand the essential why Thailand really need to kick off legal gender recognition. And it's inevitable to not feel pressure giving this talk in front of Professor Vichit Mantraporn, which is I consider as one of my inspirational person who actually inspired me to study human rights law. But just to let everyone know that this is what I think that what we should have. After being conducting research on my personal capacity or on behalf of Intersex Thailand, and about a few months ago that I still was working with a lovely political party, Thai Sang Thai, led by Lady Sudarat Gairapan, which is to allow me to do whatever I wanted to ensure that the voice of intersex and trans people will be counted and it will be prioritized. Whatever she and her party winning the election, the general election that's upcoming next year. So basically, I would like to share that if you really want to make sure that the law is inclusive enough, you must ensure you have 9 principles. And I will be briefly because I think I would like to have the voice from trans men and trans masculine community to be heard more than before. I got many opportunity to express my thoughts around this, but just to make sure that first, make sure that the law must in line with international human rights standards, especially the right to self-determination is what we are looking for. Sadly, that in each country, self-determination has been interpreted in different ways. Sometimes it's in line, sometimes it's not. It does not in line with international human rights standards. So, but basically, what self-determination means is like, it's human rights. It's basic. It's fundamental human rights. We born as human, as persons, and we defined our own faith. We know exactly what we want. We know exactly what we want to address. We know exactly what anatomical modification we want to go through. We know exactly what we want to remain. Even we born with intersex condition, if we born with diverse sex characteristic, where we still believe is so beautiful. You know, nothing wrong when you born with diverse sex characteristics, like I myself. So allow us to define, when you draft the law, make sure that our words, our needs has been counted. Not just doing what I always say, making a ritual like public or referendums. So don't pretend to hear us say things and then yes, correct, and then nothing appear during your amendment of any draft laws. That's what we are expected from you all. And secondly, because right to self-determination is basic human rights, you know, like it's in division, it's also inalienable. So, but even we're born with it, but it's also the duty of the state to recognize us, because when it's before the eyes of international human rights law, we are rights holder and you are the duty bearers, you know. So make sure that you do your job well in terms of recognitions by the law. And what it means is also mean throughout the other regulations. The discussion and debate around legal gender recognition is about, you know, if we grant, no, you don't grant, you recognize. So when you recognize a law, I know there are some obstacles that you might think of. For example, it will affect other laws. It will affect, for example, contract laws. It will affect also succession law, marriage laws. Just keep in mind that hearing from us well enough, and we have also international good practices from many countries, like the draft of intersex and transgender law that I have been able to compose. We learn a lot from our friends from Malta, from Norway, from Canada, from Belgium, from Luxembourg. And recently, during the third Intersex Asia Forum, we heard directly from Embassy of Belgium for the advancement in terms of like intersex inclusion for the legal gender recognitions, as well as I was surprised when he said, oh, actually we have fundamental policies, which is cover around 130 something principles to ensure that government sectors understand well. And it's also include every dimensions of rights, as Professor Wittis mentioned, right? Political rights, social, economic, social and cultural rights also should be included. And the first principle, actually I cover 3 principles already. The first principle I like to mention is make the law clear. Make the law clear because we don't need to, when the law passed, you know, the legislative procedure completed. We don't want to go to the districts and then with the registrar who questioning a lot of things with us. The law must be clear with a very like vivid, crystal clear patterns, the protocol, right? And make sure that, as Professor Wittis said, that make sure that medical interventions or certificates might not be required, you know, because if you did that, it's against the principle of self-determination. We defined our own rules of life. And so the law must be clear in terms of patterns and regulations, but also must be clear when I'm going to define in the 5th principle is that when you recognized our self-determination throughout the legal gender recognition, make it clear about what rights and duties that we should earn. So when it comes to these issues, mostly people will always think, oh, for those trans who trans their gender from male assigned at birth to females by the law, or female assigned at birth to male by the law, people might think, oh, okay, it's very easy to recognize, and it's also easier for administration, for state administration. But for those who identify as, for example, non-binary people, it's become a controversial, and a lot of debates around and what we could interpret. You know, there are even some discussion in terms of like what rights and duty after, for example, if Thailand has the legal gender recognition law, it means that transgender, for example, transgender person or non-binary people who born with female sexual organs, can they eligible to enjoy the right to work, for example? What about parental leave? What about maternity leave? You know, but because currently the law says maternity leave, they assume that because person who born with vagina and ovary considered as female can enjoy maternity leave. But if the law passed, it means the legal system must be entirely changed to respond to the new terms. So the rights and duty for trans people and non-binary people must be also, you know, like considered and very well composed in line with this. It means that it's not only like when we pass the law, but for others ministries like Ministry of Labor and also Ministries of Interiors, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Defense, etc. You know, need to come together and discuss what's right or regulations related to legal gender recognition shall be amended. You know, and it shall be amended. You know, respectively with the time bound. We don't want you to just postpone. And then we have the law without our real enforcement because it's also connected with other laws. And also we have to consider the consequences after, because when we also obtain our new legal gender recognitions, it's also related to other issues, for example, criminal law. family laws, these must be also considered with diverse group of people. That's why if you want to kick off, this process, ensure meaningful participation and put us as a center, not. I know that I've been working with many ministries in Thailand, especially Ministry of Social Development and Human Security, where they act as Thai government gender focal points unit. So I remember before I went to the UK for my LLM study, we hosted, a big event regarding of like legal gender recognition law with the minister himself. Said that we don't have to say we want to study. We need further study. Actually, we know we can actually kick off. I studied there 1 year, came back 2 years already, and actually total about 3 years. We didn't see any draft law issue from the ministry. So that's why we have to gathering and then we work on ourselves. So just to let you know that Thailand now we have like bunch of good people, smart as, knowing well the community, knowing well the legal gender recognition internationally, knowing well how to draft the law. So come and talk to us. So the last two principles I'd like to mention is, because we are currently using the Supreme Court verdicts, turned back since 2524 BE, stated that it's a blessing. Stated that the judge said a transgender woman in particular turned back around like 20, 30 years ago. I adore her so much. She was such a brave person to dare to file complaints, to legally change her name titles, including her house census and ID card. She filed into the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, okay, currently Thailand didn't have legal gender recognition law. So what we can do, let's open the Royal Dictionaries and see what does it mean when it comes to women. So in that time, the Royal Dictionary mentioned that woman means a person that can deliver, can give birth. So even though, she already undergone sex affirming surgery, but she couldn't give birth. It means she couldn't obtain her new legal gender recognition. So because of this Supreme Court verdict, it's still ongoing. You must make sure when you draft the law, you must be an article, completely eliminations, terminate this legal principle from this Supreme Court verdict. And yes, and to ensure that all the process, much, not just only in line with international human rights standard, but also considered as the, make it easier, like when we want to, change our name, change our legal name. In Thailand, it's really like, I would say Thailand has such unique culture where people can change their legal name easily, but you must ensure that you carry all the certificates of the name change together with you. So you don't need to require for court to give permissions. That's what I like the most about the current legislative system in Thailand. So make it easy like that, and make sure that all the process, we are at the center. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nada. Thank you. And then let's move on to the experience of members of TEAG Empowerment. So it's a Thai trans men group, and we have Kun Kauna and Kun Atitya to talk us through what's happening and your involvement within the gender recognition.
Hello everyone. My name is Kauna Sawakun Toto. I'm core member of TEAG Trans Empowerment. We are a trans men lead group working for trans and Tom identities, especially for human rights. I'm very humbled to be here to speak in front of Dr. Vitit, the ambassador, and very thanks to APCOM again. We are very small group, just only 4 people, with ambitions to let's try to do something change, especially for transgender underrepresented group, especially for we cannot explicitly saying that tomboy or tom in Thai can be translated in English to be transgender, right? Which Kun Atitya will explain later. But our group is focusing on working for human rights, especially for legal protection for trans people, for trans underrepresented people. So we would like to share some information with our small research, our homework, to find what are actually needs from the voice from Tom and trans masculine identity towards the gender recognition law, which I will tell you in detail later. Let me pass the mic to my colleagues.
Good evening. Thank you, APCOM, for having us to join this panel. You know, actually, I'm a little nervous because I know everyone in this room is so expert about gender, right? And that Peter To explained about this group. I think TEAG Trans Empowerment Group is I think it's the only one group about trans masculine in Thailand in this time who work with trans man right. Yes, and today we're going to share about something that some information that's so important. You know, this information not about us, but from our community, from 100, actually more than 100 person who share about this, who share about what is the struggle being a transgender, being a tomboy in Thailand, and Peter To can explain about like a background on the gender recognition law. Yes, before.
We have 4 points to discuss today. First is a background of the gender recognition law movement in Thailand. Back in 2008, you might know this name, Nok Yulada, nakap. She was the one who, and now she's the one who aggressively advocate for gender recognition. Back then in 2008, she tried to push the Gender Title Act, which is a part of Female Act. Meaning that at that time a woman want to change their gender title once a woman married to a man. In Thailand back that time she has to that person has to change the title to be Mrs. only, cannot be Miss, right? And then she tried to, let's say, push the law, the gender title, right? For transgender people, because in Thai law it seems like we almost everyone understood that the gender marker we can see only the ID card, Miss or Mr. or Mrs. some kind of that. So we didn't realize that it is a part of gender marker, it's a part of gender recognition. So even though within our survey or with our research, many of our friends think like to change a gender marker, meaning that to change gender title, which is, I think it's different law, right? Different law in Thailand, to govern in Thailand right now. So back then in 2008, Nok Yolada could not put the law to change that transgender people could change their gender title. But she made a phenomenon as well that the term of the transgender arrived in Thailand, and Sati Khampet or trans women have been recognized by media, by many people. And then in 2012, there was an intersex person with the help of Human Rights Commission. They were able to change their gender title from Mr. to Miss because of the medical condition that they have been intersex. So doctor prescribed that this person is an intersex person, so she can use the gender title Miss. And then this year, in 2022, there is a committee naming a Gender Act Committee, a draft a gender recognition law, which is important because they claim that this is a community draft law. This draft law draft by 3 organizations. First, Rainbow Sky Association Thailand. Second, Transsexual People Association Thailand. And Thai Transgender Network. And then they have been, have made public hearing for regions already in the north, in Bangkok, northeastern and the south, to listen to the community that what are actually their needs. But what we're trying to show you today is that because TIC, trans empowerment, we feel that the law is not cover or it's not protect all genders, and lack of the voice of community, especially for Tom and trans masculine community. And right now there is another community as well, I could say non-binary community, that they feel they left behind from this draft law. Even they claim this is a community draft law, right? So TIC rolled out an online survey asking anyone who identify themselves as a Tom, trans masculine, trans non-binary, or any shade, let's say assigned female at birth, to any identity. And then what we found is that 52% of our participants who joined this survey want the gender marker X. They do not want to change to be just only the binary norms, like I'm born like Toto, I'm born as a female, I want to transform to be a man, but A want to, okay, I'm a tomboy, but I do not want to change my gender marker to male, but I want X. This is what we heard from the community. Just only 40% want to change their gender marker to be male, and some want to keep their gender marker to be female. And this is what kind of the evidence base, the first evidence base for Tom and trans masculine community on what actually we need for the gender recognition. So since we touched base on the Tom identity, which we lack of information and knowledge about this community identity, our friend Athidiya could explain further on who are Toms and Tomboy or Tom trans.
Okay. Something is missing in gender recognition law, especially Tom identity, that were missing in this law. Actually, I do some script follow my script because I have to make sure the information of our community is still, people is still hear about this. Okay, if we talk about trans masculine in Thailand, we have the local gender identity is called Tom identity, and Tom identity is I think most people in Thailand have this identity, and Tom identity has been missing in the gender recognition law, and in this result, then we found Tom identity don't feel they fit in any gender between male and female. They never feel they are men or women. They feel they are between about this. It means they are non-binary in some way. But in this law is don't recognize them, don't add gender, X gender for them. And in Thailand, Tom identity is emerged around 1970. Tom identity is from the word on English. I think people know about this, but I have to emphasize about this again because it is important. Because Tom express themselves between men and female, and sometimes they act and behavior like a man, but they never define themselves as a man. It means this law is under gender binary. They don't see many spectrum of gender about trans-masculine group in Thailand. They never see that. I have many scripts to share the many problems about if that law don't recognize gender, what happened to them. Firstly, Tom always have awkward situation when people misgender them, such as call them like a woman, is called คุณผู้หญิง all the time, and try to emphasize or recall them as a miss all the time. Like me, I have that experience. Secondly, it's hardly to find a job. For example, a professional job like a doctor or teacher, because the most people think transgender man or Tom identity isn't the people who deserve to respect because they are not usual people, usual person. Lastly, Tom identity worry about when they meet a new people, they don't know what people teach them. Maybe people teach them like women, try to take care of them all the time. I think it's not like they try to confirm themselves not female, not women. Why they still fit in the something like a way that people try to look after them like a women. However, if you see that this survey, yes, and you will see some Tom prefer to use X gender more than represent themselves as a male. In another hand, the Committee of Gender Identity, Gender Expression, and Gender Characteristic Act is too long name. In Thailand, doesn't take awareness about this, and this situation affects the trans-masculine community because their voice and their identity are not invisible in this act. So the last topic, I want to talk about recommendation for gender recognition law in Thailand. This recommendation from our community that I told you before, more than 100 people who did this survey. First include and protect gender X in the gender recognition law because there are Tom and trans masculine who want to be recognized as a gender X rather than male. Second, trans person who already changed their gender recognition should not be required to present the document proof of changing the gender for marriage registration. Third, intersex must not need to choose to be female or male. They should be able to be intersex. We also have a line from intersex group. Fourth, government officials should be trained on how to serve to trans people on this process. 5, change the gender title law in order to be fully protect trans people. 6, contribute fund to small group, especially Tom and trans masculine, non-binary, transgender, and invest more on research to need of underrepresented group. 7, empower small group and underrepresented groups. And Peter, you can explain more about it?
I think I missed something that there are 3 draft laws for the gender recognition law right now. First is from the Gen Act, the Gender Recognition Law Committee, which is the claim this is a community draft law. Second from Khao Kai Party, they're going to launch a public hearing starting from next month. And the third one is from the Social Development and Human Security Department, which is they didn't announce it yet, but they are on process to draft this law. So
And Intersex Thailand.
yes, and Intersex Thailand, yes, this is the one that already rolled out weeks ago. So there are 4, right? 4 draft law of the gender recognition law. The positive thing is that from what we heard and we see until now, the draft from Intersex Thailand, the draft from Gen Act, and also Khao Kai Party, the principle is any people could change their gender marker based on their self-determination. This is the progress that we see, but from the Department of Social Development and Human Security, we don't know it yet, but hopefully they will apply this principle, the right to self-determination one. And I want to highlight something. We are very grassroots group. We run from 2016 with no money in our pocket. We run by volunteer group, very small one, and we were so much struggling to draft and write a good proposal, and how to create somehow KPI or let's say measurement M&E somehow. It's like we don't know, but we try our best to, let's say, to do something that we can do. So some sort of funding right now, since I've been in volunteer, this is my 10 years already. I forgot about money already, but of course we sacrifice a lot of time and energy to do this kind of thing, and trying our best to voice out from the ground is that we of course we need money, but we need to strengthen our community, even lacking of some kind of resources. But if you have resources, you must prioritize the one who really left behind and don't represent. Because I understand that to grant the fund, right, to try to build capacity building, it's not just about money, it's how to, let's say, compliant with the financial policy, or let's say having some capacity to organize things properly. But with a very small group and very, let's say, less power people, it's very difficult to do that. So that's why I think that we are very ambitious to start this thing. And I thanks for my co-worker, Jim, Nook, and Pimon, who is not here, for your kind heart. And we will, again, try to do our best to make the change. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, TIC Empowerment. I'm so sorry, we are really running out of time, and yeah, please do talk to the people here in the FCCT venue. Round of applause to Kun Nada, Kun Toto, and Kun Nuk for speaking up about the gender recognition law in Thailand, and your leadership in terms of ensuring that the grassroots community organizations are very much involved and going out of your way to actually get the data to help ensure that the gender recognition law is actually going to be used by the people that it's intended for. Last but not least, so thank you everyone for being available here in this really beautiful venue and also online. Our partnership with the Canadian government, particularly with the Thailand embassy here, the Canadian embassy in Thailand, has been phenomenal. And I would actually invite to give a closing remarks and also to maybe close out this session as well, Ambassador Dr. Sarah Taylor. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. Sawadee-ka. It's getting very late, so I will try and be short. And just say a few things about Canada, what we're doing in Canada, and then also maybe a little bit about what we're doing in the region. I feel sometimes at events like this that Canada is made out to be some sort of paradise, that we're the place of LGBTQI rights, that everything is wonderful in Canada. And I think it's actually very important to remember that in Canada, it was within my lifetime that same-sex sexual intercourse was decriminalized. Maybe even within Professor Vitit's lifetime, though I know he's much younger than me. This is recent history. This is not a long time in the past. And moreover, that for many years, even after decriminalization, we had an unofficial policy, if you like, but that was followed within many areas of government and particularly within our military and police of essentially persecuting people who were gay on the very spurious grounds that because they were gay, and this was somehow a shameful thing, that therefore they were a security risk because someone might blackmail them about their perfectly legal sexuality. And that continued into the 1990s in some quarters in Canada. Things are good, but they could be better, and that's still very recent history. So I'm very conscious, Professor Vitit, you talked about moving from repeal of criminalization laws through to protecting, to expunging past criminal records, to remedy, and to education, those different steps that you needed to go through. And we're still very much in that process in Canada. So it was only fairly recently that actually our government issued an apology for that, the so-called LGBT purges that had happened within government and within our security services over a period of about 40 years, was only, and as part of that started to expunge criminal records and to provide redress for people who, in some instances, were driven out of their jobs because of, not because of their sexuality, but because someone else felt that their sexuality somehow made them a security risk. So we are still on that pathway around moving forward to now that we've got past the decriminalization, but in the areas of protection, expunging past wrongs, and education, we've still got a lot to do. But I think we are getting there and doing a number of things which I think are very important parts of the later steps of that process. So ensuring greater visibility for our LGBTQI community, ensuring legal protections. So for example, we recently passed in the Canadian Parliament a law against so-called conversion therapy. So making it illegal for anybody to try and convert, in inverted commas, somebody's sexuality because they were gay. and protection for the LGBTQI community, specifically from hate speech and discrimination. And now looking on towards the future, and we actually have an action plan to try and promote LGBTQI rights. So we are working through those stages that Professor Vitit outlined, I think, so well. But we also recognize that we've still got quite a way to go. So that's maybe our own internal process. But then, as you can gather from the speakers tonight, we're quite active in supporting issues around LGBTQI rights in this region and elsewhere. And you might wonder, why are we doing this? And we certainly get criticism from some quarters that, you know, this is Canada interfering in the internal issues and the domestic politics of other countries. So I always want to point out that we do this for really a couple of very simple reasons. One is that a commitment around universal rights and respect of universal rights is an important part of our foreign policy. So it's something, foreign policy is not just about accepting others as they are, it's also about trying to advocate for things you want to see in the world. So it is a core part of our foreign policy to advocate around these rights. And in addition, we know that many of our partner countries are signatories to various international conventions and treaties, and again, partly as Professor Vitit outlined, which make them responsible for meeting those standards too. And those are international standards. So those are in the domain of international issues of foreign policy, and therefore we feel that gives us standing to say to other countries, you know, we should all be meeting these international standards that are defined in various UN conventions and treaties. And that you and us as signatories, we all have a responsibility to work together. And so when we work both to support grassroots organizations like APCOM and also to advocate with governments in this region and elsewhere, it's because we see this as part of our commitment to these international agreements. Want to just speak very briefly to a few examples of some of the things we're doing. So you've already seen we're very pleased to be supporting APCOM on a regional project. So it's not just here in Thailand, but also covers Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, and Philippines. So bringing together voices, just as we heard tonight, and I think this was a wonderful example, being able to hear people speaking in their own voices about the issues that matter to them around socioeconomic inclusion and human rights within the LGBTQI community. We're also working with another group, the Equal Asia Foundation, and they're looking very specifically around economic empowerment for LGBTQI businesses and workers. And we work in a number of different areas, and we have for a long time. In fact, looking again at Professor Vitit, who was the first independent expert for the UN on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. The creation of that position was something that Canada very much supported right from the start. And we're also a founding member of the Equal Rights Coalition, so partnership that's 42 countries now, civil society, multilateral organizations committed to promoting full and equal enjoyment of rights by LGBTQI persons worldwide. So those are just a few examples of some of the things that we are doing in the region. So again, not just the advocacy at the level of the governments, but also working with civil society, with grassroots, and with people at all levels to try and move things forward. I'll maybe just speak to one of our other projects because I have a nice little prop that my embassy has given me that I wanted to show you, one of our latest projects and something very practical. So we produced guidelines on supporting human rights defenders. They're called Voices at Risk. And as an international document, that's been translated into the various UN languages. So, and this is just a little postcard that explains it. But Thai is not a UN language, so one of the projects we just did was to translate it into Thai. So there you are. There is Voices at Risk in Thai. we're very proud to have done that, and we encourage you all to make use of it. So it is a document about protecting human rights defenders and voices that speak out for human rights in general, but including specifically, there's a specific section on LGBTQI rights defenders. So that's just a few examples of the things that we're doing that are sort of making what one famous rights advocate called good trouble. We like to do that. So as I said, some practical examples of what we're doing. But I'd like to end maybe just by coming back to the bigger picture about why we do this again in Canada and then in the region, in the world with our partners. So I look back in Canada and think from my own perspective, if I had been born maybe 50 years before I was in Canada, I'm left-handed, so I write with my left hand. If I'd been born 50 years earlier, I would have been made to change and write with my right hand, because that was done for all children in Canada not so long ago, because being left-handed was somehow seen as deviant and unnatural. If I'd been born 100 years ago in Canada, I would not have been considered a person. It took until 1929 and a Supreme Court challenge before women in Canada gained the right to take a seat in the Senate, because our original founding constitution said that the Senate was open to persons over 30 years of age, and until 1929, our court said women were not persons as defined by that law. So you think about things like that, and that says to me, I mean, both we look at how far we've come, but also how important it is for all of us to think about and challenge these ideas and these definitions about what is natural or unnatural, and about who belongs and who doesn't belong. Because I think so much of what I heard from all of you who are doing very courageous work today is about fighting against this view that somehow what you are, or who you love, or just the way you were born is somehow unnatural, and that someone else gets to define that and to say in law, oh, no, you don't belong. You're not equal, you're not a full person. And that we have to always be on the lookout for that and say to ourselves that is not the case, that we are what we are, that human beings, that if it's human, it's natural, and that no law or no religion gets to tell you that what you are in yourself is somehow unnatural or wrong. Next year, we will be seeing the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Very important milestone. And another international document Canada was very proud to be associated with from the very start. It was a Canadian who was one of the main drafters of that declaration. But I think very important that we try and celebrate that 75th anniversary by trying to reach as much as possible that vision of universal, indivisible rights that apply to all people as humans, not as men, not as women, not as this, not as that, just as human beings who all should enjoy equal rights. Professor Vitti cheered us up, and some of the other speakers, with the sense that maybe very soon in Singapore that we will see decriminalisation, that we have other positive movements that are happening. I just saw earlier this evening the news that Anwar Ibrahim has become the Prime Minister in Malaysia. So there is positive movement. I don't kid myself that we will reach perfection by December 10th, 2023, but I do very much hope that we will have made some significant advances by then, that we will have more things to celebrate by that date. And rest assured that Canada will be very much there to celebrate that with all of you. Thank you very much. Khop khun mak.